My name is Kevin Keegan, and it's both my privilege and pleasure on behalf of the Boyden team, my Irish partner, Maurice Carr, our CEO, Nick Robeson, our UK managing partner, Lisa Farmer, in conjunction with David Duffy and Liam Shield of the Corporate Governance Institute, to welcome you here this evening. In 2019, Maurice Carr, Nick Robeson, and I established Boyden in Ireland, continuing the legacy of Sidney Boyden, who pioneered the executive search and leadership advisory industry, leveraging the strength and resources of our UK business and Boyden World Corporation, with over 75 offices, 1,000 employees, and 300 partners worldwide. With care and consistency, we deliver 3 lines of service: executive search, interim, and leadership consulting, to curate, connect, and cultivate Ireland's companies and global leadership talent. In our global and non-executive director practice, as both leadership advisory consultants and executive search practitioners, we talk with chairmen who are looking for broader and more diverse talent for their board. We also speak regularly to executives who want to develop their careers and are looking for guidance on how to plan their transition to the non-executive director. Tonight's event seeks to share some of our insights and to broaden these discussions. Moderated by Derval MacDonald, with David Duffy from the Corporate Governance Institute setting the scene, our highly experienced panel of non-executive directors, including Conor Brady, Gillian Harford, and our chairman, John Dembitz, will share with you their experience, their insights, and how they've managed their own personal journey and how they continue to do it. We've all given up our time this evening from our busy lives, time with family to attend tonight, and for a purpose. I would encourage each of you to participate, ask questions, get involved, and push the panel for the type of answers that you want. Over a well-aimed glass of wine, we will take the time to speak with some of the Boyden and CGI team members. Now, we can't compete with the David Cameron and the various stars that Derval has been interviewing over the last couple of weeks. But ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, put your hands together, please, for our moderator, Derval MacDonald.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Kevin. I'd love to interview some leading British politicians if they actually appeared. They seem to be missing over the last few days or so, as that those extraordinary events are unfolding across the RC. For those of you who don't know, my name is Derval MacDonald, former Group Business Editor of Independent News and Media, and myself, a non-executive director, currently actually in my first non-executive chair position. So if nothing else, I'm here as much for the education as much as here to inform and entertain you. We have a brilliant night ahead of you, an excellent panel who are going to be chatting to us about that transition from executive to non-executive, which, like a lot of things in life, probably sounds easier than it actually is, going from that position of power, holding all of the decisions, moving into more advisory yet hugely accountable role. We're going to be looking at key things, not least the difference between an executive and a non-executive director, but also how to approach those roles. If you're new to this and you're trying to get involved more as a non-executive director, to look at how you build your brand, build your portfolio, and get yourself in a position. And we'll also be looking at key issues such as diversity, as well as looking at the future of boards and governance. So to set the scene for us, and without further ado, let's hear from David Duffy, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Corporate Governance Institute. We're then going to have our panel discussion. But as you heard Kevin say, it is a conversation. So Anna will have a mic for us, and we'll be coming to you as well to really do what Kevin has invited to do, which is push the panel even more than I will. So without further ado, David, I'll hand over the floor to you. Take care.
Well, good evening, everybody. The last time I spoke at a function to do with governance was in Cork about 3 years ago, pre-COVID. And it was a well-known professional service organisation, 2-day conference, big dinner on Thursday night, big lunch on the Friday night. I was asked to speak at 3 o'clock. At 5 to 3, there was only one person in the room. I spent months on my presentation. And I asked the organisers, will I wait? No, they'll fill in, they'll fit in. They didn't fill in. There was still only one person there at 3 o'clock. So I gave my chat, 3:45, a few questions from the guy, and I left the stage after thunderous applause. He says, "Where are you going?" I says, "I'm going to my room." He says, "You can't, I'm the next speaker." So the journey from being exec to non-exec actually can be challenging because it's not an easy route, and it's kind of a cottage industry. So if you said, "I want to be a non-exec director tomorrow," most people say, "Where do I go? Who do I talk to?" Well, there's no obvious path, I can tell you, so far. You can talk to people. You can talk to your friends who are non-execs. I can move this, okay? And you can talk to people like Boyden, who would be, no doubt, experts in this. But there's no well-trodden path. The other thing generally is there's no job description. So, if you're going for a CEO role or a CEO role, you know what it looks like. But being a director on a board, you'll have your specific, legal and governance responsibility if it's a regulated entity. But beyond that, you're probably wondering, why am I there? And what you should be looking for in terms of the organization is, and you're asked to join it, do they have a compelling strategy? Is it realistic? Do I believe in it? And can I see a role for myself? Because if you can't, move on. So career guidelines are hard to get. I don't think anybody's ever written a book on, how I made it as an NED. And if they have, please contact me because I'd love to read it. Maybe somebody has, I don't know. The other thing here is I think you need to be very clear about your career objectives. I mean, we're all crystal clear about, I want to be a chartered accountant, or I want to be an entrepreneur, or whatever it might be, or I want to be a search executive. When you're thinking about an NED, sometimes it's not clear, well, I want to get on the boards of funds, or a PLC, or a charity, or How do I start? Where do I start? And it ain't that easy. You've got to think about that in some detail. So some people try to build a portfolio of for-profit and not-for-profit. It's hard to do not-for-profit if you don't have for-profit beforehand, to give a mix of experience and expertise. So another thought for you would be, is where do you start? Most people start far too late. Sorry if you're in the room here and you want to consider becoming an NED. It's too late, but there is hope with good guidance and advice. I've had people coming to me in their kind of early 30s, where do I start? And in fact, we've had 2 people doing our diploma recently who are under 35. My advice would be to try and get a job on a non-profit. Preferably, it's a legal entity and it's a limited liability. Most sports organizations aren't, they're associations, so you're exposed to liability. And try and get a brand behind you, like Bernardo's, which is really well governed. And that's a stepping stone to being in the boardroom or being on the audit committee. You might even start an audit committee if you're a chartered accountant or another variation of it. But try and find somewhere to start, and start sooner rather than later. And I'm sure most people in this room have, parts of what they need to be a non-exec director. But the key thing then is, how do you package that? How do you put it together? So you think about, what am I selling? Because you are the product. It's not somebody else. It's not what you used to sell in your executive career. You are the product, and you've got to figure out what's that product for what market, and what's your USP. Why should a particular board hire you over somebody else? So the big things at the moment that people are looking for, boards are looking for, according to PwC, are cyber, surprise, surprise, ESG, and digital transformation, and corporate governance, to state the obvious. So I would recommend you do a SWOT on yourself, and talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues to see, what am I made of? And do they believe it? And try to figure out what you need to improve or add experience to what you already have. The search will take you a lot longer. I was launching a book on the Institute of Chartered Accountants 3 years ago, and more than one person came, which was great. And there's a guy there who was, he had done the IOD Chartered Directorship program here. He'd also done the Smurfit one, and he waited the phone to ring. It never rang. So you need to be really visible in the market. And it's not who you know, and I'm sure you know millions of people, but it's actually who knows you. That's much more important. And they won't know you unless you're visible, and visible on LinkedIn, doing blogs, doing webinars, networking with purpose, not just networking, with purpose, and all that type of stuff. And your LinkedIn profile is really, really important, because a place like Boyden will be going for keywords on your LinkedIn profile. So your SEO has got to really slick. So you need to figure out what words you want to be prominent on your LinkedIn profile. If you don't get that right, people won't find you. So, get your 18-year-old to help you on key search words, and that's really important. A couple of thoughts in terms of if you're asked to become an NED is, don't say yes on the phone. That's madness. Ask to meet for coffee, but consider 3 things. I did mention the strategy one. The other thing is, are they solvent? And that's quite important, because if they're not and you go on that board, well, then your personal assets are at risk. Don't let them give you a set of statutory accounts, because they could be 9 months out of date. Ask for the most recent management accounts. And if they don't have them, that's a red flag in my view. If they're kind of 3 months old or 6 months old, that's too late. You won't see the most relevant ones. And you might have to sign an NDA to do that. The other thing is, what does their governance look like? And if they've limited information about governance on their website, that's another red flag. I was speaking on an RTE program about 3 years ago about a charity that didn't do well. Shouldn't remain nameless. They asked me to come along. I was on my Mac in the taxi trying to figure out, well, who's on the board here? What are their bios? Are there accounts there? It was a charity, and there was nothing there at all. So I couldn't actually comment on drive time. So consider that. The role. So it's a very different role being a non-exec director. You've got to be really comfortable being away from the operations of the organization and be comfortable with policy and strategy and being able to join up those nebulous dots in the future to add real insight into where the organization should be going. And directors are called directors for a very good reason, because they're there to direct. They're not there to manage, they're there to direct, and have a huge kind of oversight role. And a key skill for any director is to be able to challenge constructively and to agreeably disagree with the rest of the board, and that's a key skill. But a lot of inexperienced non-exec directors tend to get too stuck into what they knew before, but you've got to lift yourself above that. And if you can't do that, well then being an NED is not for you. You should do something else. So the life and times of an NED is not a straight line. It's like life, it's different. And if you're asked to go on a board and say, well, it's only 12 days a year, David, double it at least, because there'll be some crisis. I mean, think of COVID. If you're on the board of any organization then, they would have been struggling, the revenue would have been disappearing, you've got to lay off people and all the rest of it. And a lot of boards there met an awful lot of times. I was on a board once of an organization, we had a real problem. We had 8 board meetings in 2 months, and it just took over my life. It was on RTE, it was in the newspaper, it was everywhere, it was horrendous. And that was just a non-profit. It was very, very difficult. And my big concern was, maintaining my name, which I managed to do despite everything. So last but not least, I'm sure I'm saying about 7 minutes here, you've only one reputation. Guard it with your life. And if you're asked to go on a board, make sure you do really, really good due diligence. I'll end on that.
Thank you very, very much. And you're going to join me.
Okay.
Thanks very, very much, David, for setting the scene for us. David is going to join us, as is Gillian Harford, who's country executive for not for Better for Balance, for 30% Club. Why has that just disappeared from my head? Conor Brady, he describes himself as journalist and author, the former editor of the Irish Times. He's going to join us as well as John Dembitz, who is chair of Boyden and has just an amazing, amazing corporate career. So maybe we'll give a warm welcome to all of them to join us. Conor, I might start with you because normally it's the editor-in-chief who gets to ask all the tricky questions.
Afraid you might.
It's nice to turn the tables a little bit. Just what we were talking about earlier at the beginning about the transition from being an executive to a non-executive. Like, I mean, presumably, I know you wouldn't give away your contacts, but presumably in your role at the editor of the Irish Times, you've got a speed dial to Cabinet or to the captains of commerce, whoever it is. You're in a very powerful executive position. And then suddenly you're not. You're the ex.
Yes, you describe it very well.
They never call, they never write.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things I would say for a start. You know, when you're in that kind of role I was in as editor of the Irish Times, and there's a whole lot going on around you, and you are in contact with people who were at the centre of activities, you know, it's a dull week that will pass without somebody coming to you and say, when you step out of this job now, you give me a call because we've got things to talk about. And we've got opportunities to examine together. That doesn't happen. None of them. They all disappear like snow on a ditch. But what does happen is that messages come from unexpected quarters, and you if you have been. And David had put this very well. You have to have a profile, I suppose. And if you have a profile as a newspaper editor, then that helps. But I found that a lot of the people who said they would want to do business with me just disappeared. But out of nowhere came inquiries from people who said, "Would you like to talk to us?" And I remember particularly, I got a call from City University in New York. Would I like to go as a visiting professor there for 2 years? Which was a wonderful change from the hurly-burly of the newspaper. And I remember going to John Jay College, Criminal Justice College in City University, and I couldn't understand. I had been in the busiest possible job, and now suddenly I was doing nothing, as I thought. And I went into the president one day, and I said, "Jerry, I'm being paid to do nothing." And he said to me, "Conor, you're not paid to do, you're paid to be." So I was very relieved.
But is there something in that, though? You know, do you worry about currency, Gillian? You know, when you're making that transition, I guess, from the executive to the non-executive world, do you think people worry about, you know, do I have currency? How long does it last? Or how do I build it up in a different way to get those kind of unexpected calls?
It's really funny because I wasn't quite sure how I was going to answer some of these questions. I never like to plan in advance. And you used the word currency earlier on, and it put an idea in my head. And for those of you in the room who are old enough to remember moving from pounds to euros, it's a bit like that. Overnight, you are still legal tender, but you get spent in a very different way. so there is something about that. You know, overnight, you're in a room where you are no longer the elder lemon, because most of us have spent our lives in corporate worlds where we have the organization expertise, we have history behind us, and all of a sudden you're the newbie. And I still remember, and please, this is not imposter syndrome. I do not count myself as a very well-established and very well-experienced board member. I still count myself as a newbie with this panel. But I would say for the first 6 months of my first board, I prefaced every question with, "This might be a silly question," or "I am not an expert on this industry, so can I just ask?" It took me a while to actually say, well, my job here is to ask stupid questions once, not twice. Once is allowed. Second time, you're expected to have learned. But I felt like I went from being the elder lemon to the newbie. I went from being the doer to the overseer, which I found very, very strange because I am a doer by nature. I went from being the person who asked the questions as opposed to the person who gave the answers. I had spent years presenting to a board as the person who was expected to have the answers, and now all of a sudden I was the person with the questions. And I went from being a specialist to a generalist. And I think particularly David's point, I think when you do your first board, you think you are going there because of the expertise that you have. But really the value you bring is more around who you are. And if you go in to be the expert, you're not going to be as successful as if you go in to be a member of a team that has quite a different job to do.
John, David was saying, you know, when you go in as an NED, you're not the executive management team. You are not there to deliver the strategy. You're in a very, very, very different role. And sometimes, and again, it would have been my own experience starting out on boards as an NED, is that, you know, you might be quite timid at first because you're maybe afraid for a little time to maybe push back. And to say no, or to, be a critique of things. How valuable is that power to say no and to push back, even if you're not doing the things, but to advise in that role?
Okay. The question is, how important is it to say no? I term it the positive no. We all grow up as kids and no is negative. Don't put your finger in the socket, get a slap. Don't do this, don't do that. When in fact, in a professional corporate environment, I think, especially as a non-exec, especially as someone who's looking in from the outside, the ability to say no is hugely important and massively underrated. As a non-executive, it is your role to scrutinize, to hold the executive to account, to be completely up to date with what's going on in terms of the strategy, in terms of the investment objectives. And if you do not believe that it makes sense, it's your responsibility, absolutely your responsibility, to say no. It's actually hugely positive. If more non-execs in Royal Bank of Scotland had the preparedness to say no to a powerful chief executive, it wouldn't have gone bust. It's as simple as that. And being able to say no covers a huge range of topics. No to bullying, no to mistreatment of people, no to not making a hire when a hire should be made, no to making a hire when it's the wrong hire, etc., etc. It's very important. It's very critically important, in my view. If you are a non-executive with purpose and you have the self-confidence to be able to sit around the table and you've done your homework, you absolutely have to put your hand up.
Dave, can I ask you just what you were talking about, due diligence, whether you're actively out seeking for an NED role or you've been approached about it, there is a process of due diligence that the organisation or entity will take on you to check out on you. But just what you were talking about, the due diligence on the organisation itself, how far into how deep can you go? Obviously, there are two phases when you're there, but also then when you're on the board, how far do you go? If you've got a resistant executive management team, if you really want to get your kind of hands and eyes under the bonnet, how do you go about it?
Well, I think before you go that far, you need to sort of talk to current board members, talk to the chair, talk to the senior executive, seeing if you like them, if you like their values, if you like the culture of the organisation. But you don't want to end up in an organisation where there's a toxic culture. Not a pleasant place to be. I've been there once, and trying to get out of it is tough. And resigning is difficult. You just can't suddenly resign from a board. Otherwise, that's going to carry with you in your career. So that's not an option. I suppose when you're on the board, I think it's up to the board to make sure there's interaction between the executive and the board. And I'm a great believer in like a strategy away day once a year or twice a year, where you get to meet the executive and you see the white of their eyes. And, because you've got to, I think, if you're new onto the board, as you are, do I trust these people? Do I trust what they're giving me? And, I did a board review of a well-known PLC not too long ago, and 3 non-execs signed up to this board from various parts of Europe. They hadn't done their due diligence on their financial reporting systems, which, as it turned out, weren't that reliable for a PLC. Now, that's something I wouldn't have thought of doing, quite honestly. Yeah. That's kind of basic, but they weren't there.
And it's really interesting point, Gillian. I lecture on an executive education programme, and we often bring up Peter Drucker's famous phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And with due respect to Peter, I think he got it wrong, because I think the wrong culture can devour everything in its path. What is the role of the NED in because sometimes you may not discover that until you've got your feet in under the table.
I think it's a really interesting one, like when you think about NED 101. And as David said, there is no job description. And we all know the theory. You do the IOD program, you do the Smurfit program, you think I'll learn by doing.
CGI, I think both.
Yes. And there are lots of, and the first thing that you will always do in the class around culture is that culture comes from the board and culture is set by the board. And the reality of that is really challenging. Like if you think of a board situation, particularly like at one stage during COVID, I was on 3 different boards. We couldn't go on site anywhere, so how do you set the culture when you can't go on site? How do you set the culture when really you're coming together maybe 12 times a year? But it is true that culture has to start there. And I think it comes from some of the points that we've heard already. I particularly like the idea that you have to be able to say no. So where are the board looking in terms of evidence of good culture? Where are they looking for evidence of areas that are going wrong? Like I had a number of years where I got very well trained with a fantastic audit committee chair called Catherine Woods. I used to have to go in and present to Catherine Woods 4 times a year on Speak Up, on whistleblowing, on culture training, on how it was being measured, and I took that when I went into a board role, and I would sit there and I would go, what would Catherine Woods do? And what question would she ask? But they are the type of topics that you have to be prepared to tackle as a board member. And they're topics that sometimes are not quite a reluctance, but sometimes you have to convince the CEO that these are topics that we want to see on the agenda. And the question gets asked, well, it's not relevant in terms of the financials, or it's not relevant in terms of sales, or it's not relevant in terms of customer satisfaction. And you're saying, but it is really relevant in terms of the culture and how things get done around here. But it was probably one of the things I found hardest to take from theory into practice, because you feel a culture when you go into a building, but it's very hard to talk about and very hard to describe.
John literally wrote the book on people. I think it was your 3rd book out last year, looking at people. On that, John, like you were talking earlier, saying, no tolerance for, zero tolerance for bullying, poor culture, whatever. If you've got a member of the executive, or perhaps a few of them, that are kind of resistant to that, how do you get around? How do you access the people underneath to really, considering that the board has ultimate responsibility for culture?
Can I just I'll answer your question, but something Julian said, which I think is incredibly important and quite instructive. During COVID, when you couldn't go to the offices were shut. You were suddenly having board meetings on a weekly basis with the executive teams. There was a huge, I chair currently 6 different companies. There was a huge difference in the culture as it manifested itself during that COVID period.
In a good or bad way?
Sorry? In a
good way.
Well, in a good and bad way. That's the point. There was one of the organizations, or a few of the organizations, suddenly really got to understand how important people, they had to be supportive of their staff. They had to reach out. They had to provide chairs. They had to provide computers. They had to go the extra mile in so many different ways. There were some organizations that just said, everyone's home, we're going to look at who to make put on furlough or cut the cost down. Very different. And the impact on culture that those actions had will persist into post-COVID, and has persisted into post-COVID. Now, the question that you asked me, which was how do you deal with, how do you dig in to an organization to be able to understand? As a non-executive, one of the things is, whether you're a non-executive chair or a non-executive director, one of the things you've got to do is reach out and meet the people. You've got to walk the floor. If it's an organization which has a whole bunch of depots around the country, go to the depots. Agree with the chief executive that you have a program of outreach to the organization where you are talking one-to-one with a whole cross-section of people. And it's extraordinary, the sort of impact, the sort of feedback you get, because very soon they'll trust you, and they will share things with you that they might have not shared with their boss or their superiors, because you're an outsider. And that is incredibly powerful.
Conor, can I ask you, the 30% Club, certainly better balance for business. There's so much research on particular, perhaps maybe people mightn't have the confidence, or they're reticent about putting themselves forward as an NED, because particularly women might say, well, I've got 8 out of 10, but I don't have the other 2, so I better not. Men, obviously, as we know, are slightly probably say 4 or 5 and say they would still go for it. But in terms of you maybe being reticent about maybe not having the value to bring to a board, how do you overcome that? Because surely over the course of your career, or your executive career, you do have something. Because sometimes we can stop or maybe censor ourselves out of roles.
Yeah, I think there's. I think one of the things that people have to realize when they're looking into this transition is that they probably know an awful lot more than they know, and they bring a lot more value than they think they sometimes have, and they have to stop and take stock of themselves. You know, when you transition from executive to non-executive, you're not being brought in to do executive work under a different banner. You're bringing perspective, you're bringing experience, you're bringing judgment, you're bringing values. Those are the things that you bring with you. And what you have to do is, and some of the other speakers have adverted to this, you have to know when those values and that experience and that instinct and that nose tells you something is wrong, when to say no and when to take a stance, when to take a stand for values. The other side of that proposition, the difficulty is that you have to know then how to do that, but at the same time not undermine the executive staff. And the CEO has to know from the very beginning that you're not after his job or her job. And that can be a problem if you go in. I was
Particularly in smaller organisations.
Yeah, I was 52 when I left the editorship of the Irish Times, and I was very quickly involved in a couple of boards where the CEOs were actually older than I was. There were people in their mid-50s, and 1 or 2 of them did suspect that I was in there being brought in the back door to sort of, you know, cut them out from their entitlements and from their own achievements. And that's the other side of what you have to calculate, and that does require particular human skills. And I think, as John said, it's a question of going around and showing yourself and letting yourself be known, but at the same time, not poking your nose into what is the executive's areas of responsibility.
Doesn't this, so David, cut through to the whole debate about the accountability, the responsibility, and your role on a board? You're not the executive management team. You're not going in there to do it, yet you're on the hook, particularly if it's a regulated entity, and even if it's not. There are huge reputational issues. So that kind of maybe instinct not to go in and do it yourself or do it in a way that you would have done in your executive life. It's is it a tricky balance or not?
One of the key, yes, it is. But one of the key challenges being a non-executive, you're not in the business and you're relying on the information flow from the executive or a committee. So if you don't get quality information coming through, it's very hard to hold people accountable. So, you know, good boards will have strategy and there'll be KPIs, they might review it 2 or 3 times a year, and the same with the business plan. But if that isn't there, it's much harder to hold the executive to account. So one of the key things that I think boards should do, maybe once a year, is a group of non-execs get together and they look at the board papers the last 6 months or a year and saying, are we getting the right information that we need to do our job? Because it is a legal responsibility. It's not a nice to have. And I've seen organizations where they don't get the right information because the non-execs aren't on their game. They're not. And the other thing to remember about being a director, you can ask for any piece of information in the company you like, anything, because you have a legal responsibility to your shareholders to make sure you're doing your job and you report through the board to them. So some directors don't know that. You can ask for any piece of information you like.
Yeah, John, do you want to come in there?
Yeah. We're talking here about boards and being on a board. The reality is that there are all sorts of different boards. When I started on my non-exec career 25 years ago, it was difficult to believe that, I made a conscious decision, absolutely conscious decision, to aim at the SME sector, the small medium enterprise, petit et moyen entreprise in French. And that was a conscious decision on my part because I didn't want to. I spent all my professional life prior to being a non-exec with FTSE 100, S&P 500, global organizations. And I had one brief period when I was running my own business that grew and we sold it to Deloitte. That gave me the flavor for small companies. And I just had that desire to spend my rest of my time, if I could, build a portfolio, I managed to, with small, medium-sized organizations because I just felt the intensity of the relationship and the ability to impact on the destiny of those organizations was so much greater than on FTSE 100, where it's predominantly, as a non-exec, predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly governance. Increasingly today, any ESG-related stuff. And being on a board of different types of organizations, being on the board of a family-owned business, being on the board of a owner-owned business, being on the board of a private equity-owned business or a hedge fund, hugely different. And the sort of issues that you need to confront, hugely different.
Yeah. Can I just talk then, Gillian, just about 30% Club, which I collaborated lots with in the past as business editor, and the role of women and I hate to, you can't call half the population other minorities, but you know what I mean, just in terms of, because even here we have amazing women in the room, but it is predominantly men in the room. In terms of the business case for diversity on executive management teams and boards has not just been met, it has been exceeded, and yet still it can be hard to get through the pipeline. Why is it important to have that diversity in boards and not to just let it be what it has been in the past, a kind of a HR function?
Yeah, I think I'd like to think that if we had chairs and CEOs in the room who have gone through this process, the biggest thing that they would say and that they say to us is that when you have diversity in the room, you have different conversations. You have far more high value conversations. You get different points of view which lead to different outcomes. Particularly when you think about it, very few organizations that we're talking about, and I agree completely in terms of, you know, it's very different between a funds board and an SME board, but some of the principles are the same. The reality of it is the shareholders are a mixed audience. It's very rare that you'll sit on a board where the customers or the shareholders or the stakeholders are just one particular part of the population. So how can you make really good conversation? I was doing some work with a very well-known food organization last week, and we were talking about diversity and their strategy. They don't aim to feed half the world. They aim to feed all of the world. So their board needs to be able to make strategic decisions, operational decisions, governance decisions around research, innovation that will take into account the whole population. If you have a very homogenous board, you're not going to get those kind of conversations. But what we are seeing, particularly as organizations look to bring more diversity on the board, they might start off with gender. But by virtue of focusing on gender, they're starting to bring in other disciplines where women are more predominantly set as executives.
And do you think the Better for Balance strategy, I think it has been quite successful, the carrot rather than stick, the targets rather than quotas? I hate quotas, I love their impact. You're more of a target girl.
I am, and I'm glad you, because this will probably come from the audience later on. I always get the question about, you know, can we not have quotas instead of targets, or can we not just promote on merit? And I always say, where did the idea come from that, you know, targets and merit are mutually exclusive? They're actually mutually inclusive. Within the 30% Club, and I passionately believe this myself, targets are the way to go. Because ultimately, diversity is a business decision. Quotas are a compliance decision. Diversity and targets are a business decision. And if we want business to be really serious about the value of diversity, they have to be accountable for it themselves. And accountability comes from a target that you set as an industry. So if we look at, you know, progress in Ireland, when we started the 30% Club in 2015, the Isaac 20 was at 12%, and it's now at 32%. That's Irish organisations stepping up themselves. Ireland has made more progress in the EU 27 than any other country with quotas because Irish business knows that this makes sense and they've stepped up. And the other thing that we've seen...
It does help when you publish things as well,
it does.
doesn't it? It does kind of encourage people on.
Yeah.
David, can I bring you in there just on... Obviously, boards are becoming much more diverse. You mentioned some of them, whether it's through cyber, ESG, everything. But something I was struck with what you were saying earlier is that perhaps even for the seasoned executive, those who've done CGI, IOD, who've done Smurfit, whatever it is just not automatic that you get onto. So the notion that you have to go out and brand yourself and market yourself for these positions is something that perhaps might be anathema to people who've normally been just used to getting things in life because of who they were in their executive life?
Yeah, it's a challenge because you're going from, a regular paycheck as an executive to if you want to become an NED, you've got to find the paychecks and then you've got to decide how many you want. And you can only have so many because you can only devote yourself to so many boards. So that's a huge challenge. So that's why I think people should start sooner rather than later so they can figure out what's the departure point from their executive career to becoming a non-executive director. So they're not waiting a year or 18 months to find something, so they can step into something. And their own organization might facilitate them moving on and they're still in their executive position, so there's good transition as opposed to there's a big gap and, avoiding your life and trying to figure out how do I get an NED job. So the whole LinkedIn thing, visibility, one should be doing that way before you leave your executive position without wanting to sort of cause any issues for your current employment. But how do I get myself out there as an expert on ABC, whatever it might be?
Conor, it can take time.
No, just going to say that I think there's a lot of psychology around it, around the move, around the transition.
Yeah.
Because you actually realize I've probably on a downward trajectory from here. I have peaked in my power and in my influence and in my ability to get things done by directive or by command. From now on, it's going to be persuasion. It's going to be soft influence. And it can be difficult emotionally. It can be difficult psychologically. The one bit of advice I would give to people is take advice. And there are people there who can give you advice. I remember the best bit of advice I got was from a man who was maybe 10 years ahead of me in the business. And he said to me, when you stop, he said, do nothing for 6 months, accept no offers, look around you, see what's on offer, think, reflect, take a holiday, travel in the slow lane, smell the roses, then start taking decisions.
Yeah. Was it worrying, did you have any scenarios where you'd be ringing the minister and then it was just like the 8 or something getting back to you? Did the power just seep away from you?
Well, it reminds me of Sean Dydon's story about going up to the Phoenix Park with Albert Reynolds surrounded by Gardaí on motorbikes to hand in his seal as Taoiseach. And on the way back, they realised there's no motorbikes.
I think your life can change.
But I remember distinctly, I had, when you were editor of the Irish Times, if you rang a minister, you got a minister. But a month after I left, I rang the late Seamus Brennan. And I got through to the personal secretary and I said, it's Conor Brady here. And the secretary said, from where? And I had nothing to say. And he said, okay, I'll let the minister know you rang.
I suppose because for so long you would have been saying your name with your organisation afterwards.
Absolutely,
and then suddenly you're in a different scenario.
Yeah.
We have a microphone. Anna, if we have it here, we'll take it from the podium here if you have any questions. And please, we've got about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. But just as Anna's setting that up, John, I just wanted, just to maybe get your thought, because sometimes when I speak, I'm 45 now, and when I speak to some of my contemporaries, they say, oh my God, there's so much compliance. There's so much, rules and governance. Sometimes they feel a little bit deterred from it. But it can be very, very rewarding when, as you say, it could be whatever the type of organisation, it can be very, very rewarding to go on that journey with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I said, you need to think about the type of organisation you want to engage with. The level of governance, there's governance everywhere. Even with the SME sector, there are certain things, you still need an audit. You still need to get your accounts in.
Especially with the charity sector here after all of the reform. Yeah.
But you need to think this through quite carefully. We talked about branding a little bit, personal branding. And I'm just slightly at variance with some of the comments made. Going into the charity sector is usually perceived to be the easy option. I don't think it is.
No.
But if you go into the charity sector and you pick up 2 or 3 or 4 non-executive roles in the charity sector, making that transition from the charity sector into the commercial sector is actually quite difficult. I made a conscious decision 25 years ago at the age of 48, so you all know my age, if you can do some numbers, to do the SME. Even though I've chaired probably 30 companies over the last 25 years, I could not today transition into the FTSE 100 or even the FTSE 500. because I'm typecast, absolutely typecast, as an SME.
So be careful
So
about
be
the
careful
organisation.
what you want
Be careful
and
what
make
you
your choices.
Brilliant. Anna, you have the microphone there. And if you just let us know who you are and where you're from and who you want to push, and very hard push on the panel because I'm just moderating here, so you can go easy on me. But have we got any questions? And please don't be shy.
I'm leaving an executive role on Friday. I've been thinking about it for about 6 months, and David, unlike, my company's been quite good. I went through the IOD, apologies, the other side, and that's great, and I've done something on sustainability. I guess what I'm interested in now is come Monday morning, I've no study to do, and I've no inbox full of stuff. If I was to look forward to Christmas, the end of the year, and there were 2 or 3 things I should have done by then, what would they be? Or alternatively, is that the wrong question? Is that the way an executive would approach it?
It is what they're saying, kind of when the phone stops, when suddenly you're not in demand, and no matter how big a role or position you've held, as you say, on an emotional and human level, and maybe you're at a bit of a loss because you might be thinking, no, I better do this or I better be seen at that. What was your advice kind of coming out of that? You said you kind of took a little bit of time because the advice had been just to...
Yeah, I think you do need to take time, and you do need to realise that the Monday morning is not going to be the way it's going to be necessarily in 3 months' time or 6 months' time. But it is really difficult. I remember, a couple of days after I'd left, and I still had the telephone in the car. I remember the old phones you used to have in the car. I heard something on the news, and my instinct was to reach the hand out and grab the phone and get onto the news desk and say, "What are we doing about this?" But it's a bit like bereavement. It doesn't get any better, but you get better at handling it. And you do adapt, and you do. Certainly, my experience was that after a while, things started to happen, and people began to realise that, Conor was there, and he might be interested in doing something. Now you get an awful lot of Mickey Mouse stuff. And, I was asked to edit about 6 parish newsletters, for Catholic, Protestant, Dissenter and Jewish, all in the one parish. So you can't do that, obviously. So I would say enjoy next week. If you play golf, go and play a lot of golf. Go and buy a swimming robe and go down to the 40-foot.
Yeah, it's interesting. I interviewed recently Niall Quinn and his wife Gillian on RT, and he spoke very movingly about you're top of the world. You're king of the world. And when he finished up in professional football, I said he did a lot of golf tournaments and he did a lot of socializing, and eventually his wife was just like, something's got to give here, that it was him. And she said, I'm not giving it away because she said it on her, she said this was having a huge impact. And it is something that, whether it's sports or whether it's business, that transition, David, can be difficult to manage, especially if you feel this desire, God, I must get back in and I must, do something.
My advice would be do something really different. I did a course, and my colleagues know this, in an island called Skyros in Greece about 3 years ago. And that was a course on how to be a stand-up comedian. It was a laugh.
Okay, we have a half an hour.
Up you go.
7 minutes.
And this was, you're brought out of your comfort zone. My zone is corporate governance. Suddenly you're with these 4 other people you've never met in your life before, crawling around on the floor trying to be a fish or something like that. And I haven't done that many times in my life, I have to say. But it just it gave me a different perspective, and I met very different people. Like there was one guy there he worked for British Rail Wolverhampton. His view of the world was very different from mine, I can tell you. Just different things, and I wouldn't rush. I'd forget about Christmas.
John, did people view you differently? You're in the FTSE, huge world, and then you're going to advising SMEs. Did you find that you were treated differently after that?
Yes, no. Just to answer the specific question, because there is something that I would suggest. Go down to your local bank and open an account as whatever your name is, just to have a separate account. So all the expenses that you've got, you can start to accumulate. And then you've got something that you can turn into a business account if you want to at a future date. So just put that in place. And I did that on literally the first day that I left my executive role. I slightly at variance with Conor. Yes, go and play golf. I've got no problem with that. but relationships dilute quite quickly. I would step on it and start to network and take people out for lunch, go and have dinners with them. Just keep the clock ticking over. Make sure the people that you knew don't forget you, and they know that you're moving, changing, and you're in the market. So yes, I would do that.
Yeah,
Now,
you've hit a bit of a raw nerve, Gillian. You wanted to come in there as well.
Yeah, no, I am more the doer.
It's not a self-help group now.
I know. I can't quite imagine the idea because I am now 5 years retired, and my kids kind of go, "When are you going to have a day off?" So I'm a bit more of a doer. So I would actually say, you do need to stay in the habit of doing things, and I agree with John completely about network, but I would say now's the time to rewrite your CV. If you'd like a template, I have one in the 30% Club. We give it out for our board connections to women thinking about board roles. But you need to rewrite a CV, less about what you've done and more about what you'd bring. David said in the intro, use this as the time to seriously look at your LinkedIn profile for the first time ever. I am not saying this just because of who's sponsoring the event. Genuinely, I have this conversation at least 3 times a week over coffee with women thinking about boards. Find a good search firm, particularly a search firm that focuses on boards, and have a conversation with the consultant. Get them to look at your CV, get them to look at your LinkedIn profile to see if they were doing a search, would they find you? And I like the idea of give serious thought into, if you really want to do board work, what type of board do you want to do? Because if you do that first, that then helps you in terms of networking.
I thought you were going to say give serious thought to being a stand-up comedian, Conor.
No, just one thing just occurs to me as listening to this. I may be wrong, but I suspect that probably most of us, our focus is in the private sector. There are huge opportunities in the state sector as well. And that is something that's worth bearing in mind. And there are details on the government website where they're looking for directors, and they're looking for commissioners, and they're looking for people to go into roles in support of state enterprises, everything from semi-states right through to centralized government. I was lucky in that I got a few of those. I was invited shortly after I came back from the States to join GSOC, the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission. And I realized very quickly, actually, that the kind of skills that I had were so badly needed in the public service. And they mind you, I fought with most of them, in a way that I wouldn't care to remember. But they do need the kind of skills that I suspect that a lot of people in this room would have.
You can register
for this,
and then as the appointments come up, you can do them. And there have been some very, very interesting appointments, I have to say, through that.
There's a lot of them, yeah.
Another question from the floor? Don't be shy. There, just at the back. Thanks a million. And again, just let us know who you are and if you're a stand-up comedian.
In training.
My name's Neil Pilkington. I'm actually with Boyden. I just wanted to ask a quick question on selecting companies. So once you've got your first NED and then eventually you move on to the next, if you come plural, there's only one person that gets called for a reference. How important, therefore, is it to choose the right chairman as well as the right company?
Choose the chair, David. How important is it to, when you're looking, is it to get, is it, as I understand your question, is it to get in front of that chair, as opposed to you've picked the company or the institution, the organisation, whatever it is, but the importance of getting in front of the chair or whoever's making the decision about the selection of the board members, the directors?
Well, if they have a nominations committee, and they may or may not, or some of the board might be the nominations committee, they will decide who you will get in front of if they go through due process. So there shouldn't be any favoritism at all. You might have to try to arrange them kind of off-piece somewhere if you can to make your case. Tricky. Other perspectives, that's my one.
Yeah. Well, what I want to is, because actually there's a question here from Rosari, thank you, Rosari Coleman.
I think the tricky part is you don't always get to pick the companies you want to go to. Particularly our experience helping women take on board positions. You rarely have a choice about your first board other than to say yes or no. But it would be great if you could go through the Irish Times top 1,000 business supplement, which is my favorite one of the year, to see who have I got in the 30% club and who do I not, and put a dot beside the ones that you want. There is a period where you're building your portfolio and you're following offers, but you still have to be really selective about what offers you say yes to.
And then there's a bigger question we won't get to tonight then about the types of roles that women typically serve on boards versus men. Big shout out for often communications is seen as a soft skill, but it's the first thing, as we know, from being on the other side, Conor, that people often go to when they need help. Rosario, I'll go to you.
Thank you. Rosario Coleman. I've recently retired, and my latest appointment was with the OECD in Paris. And I'm interested in, I've had public sector and private sector experience. So I'm interested in the route to a NED position. And I'm particularly interested in the difference between targeting let's say the FTSE or the publicly quoted company from an SME. And I understand that a publicly quoted company will have a more structured nomination and review process for their non-executive directors, but the SMEs may not. And I'd like to get confirmation as to whether that is the case or not, and whether there is a gradual professionalisation of the nomination of the directors.
David, I suppose you started out talking about that, about the pathway, and we've heard a lot of discussion about be careful what you wish for, be careful what you opt for, because that could determine how you are. I think the phrase that you used, John, was how you're typecast. But for those who have ambition to move towards those bigger roles where, let's be honest, women and others are required, can you alter the pathway? Can you build it up incrementally?
Well, to come back to previous point there, I think the first thing you need to do when you step out of your executive role, somebody said, well, you need to network. Absolutely, but you need to audit your current network. And then you just figure out, what networks do I need to get into to get to the places I want to get to? So you want to get to where the fish swim, because if you don't, you're not going to catch any fish. Simple as that. So I think you need to plot a path with lots of help from people like Boyden and a lot of experienced people in this room. How do I get to these roles? You could have a great sectoral expertise, which could be, you might learn in an SME, which could be useful in a PLC. And you know more than I, but this I wouldn't even pretend to. But I'd be trying to sort of say, what's the pathway here? And how do I get there? And what are the stepping stones to that over time? But the whole thing, I think...
That's why it takes time.
And the whole thing is about being visible, by writing articles and stuff, get stuff, published in the FT and things like that. And I've seen people at the FT, I'm amazed they get into it. So actually, when I was on this island in Greece, there was this Nigerian woman who started a shoe company for Nigerian women because their shoe size is bigger than normal. Then I see her on the FT 2 weeks ago, and she just did a whole series of articles on being an entrepreneur as a Nigerian woman in England. So it is possible.
But I think you're right, Rosa. You will see different processes depending on the types of organizations. So I've sat in various different seats. So, I have done recruitment with the chair working in a PLC myself. And that was very formal through the nominations committee, directly with a search firm, kept almost independent of the board to make sure that there was independence in terms of the search process, and then presented to the board at the final stages. And then, to a situation where I'd have smaller SMEs come to me in the 30% club to say, we've no nominations committee, we've no process, can you help us, or can you direct us, to somebody like David's group or some of the other smaller companies that give board advice that also help in this space. to being the chair of a state board with 5 positions to fill and working my way through the PAS process. And I have such respect for, for people who give their time to state board roles. But as the chair, I didn't get to pick the individuals, and there's no such thing as a nomination committee. So different types of organization structures have different processes. The more formal the organization is, particularly if you're in the PLC space, you definitely see a very strong role for the nomination committee.
One of the sources that is worth cultivating, and I'm sure it's as active here in Ireland as it is in the UK and most of Europe and the United States, the private equity sector. They invest heavily in SMEs because they believe SMEs have the opportunity to grow and they can benefit from that. And they will work with search firms like Boyden and like other search firms, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have their own little black book.
Or someone else's little bit.
Or somebody else's little black book.
Yeah. I have a very good one if anybody's interested in getting anyone put on their boards.
It is worth cultivating relationships with private equity houses. It's worth for them to know who you are, what you're good at, what you want to do, what role you'd be interested in, what type of organization you'd be in. It's a fruitful source of, and they are pushing the non-executive role because they absolutely believe in it.
It is my, if I time Kevin just for one last question, just to take, because I want to get you to your second glass of wine, which is even more important than the first. So we'll take this question from this gentleman here.
My name is Con Quigley. So I'm an accidental non-executive director at the moment, but my main mission at the moment is to try and help a company recruit a board for the first time. And I'm finding it a nervy enough experience. And I've certainly learned quite a bit from listening here today, but it may result in some of the same answers just being played back. But what advice would you have for a company, a private company, moving for the first time to build a board? And what are the first steps for it?
David, I presume looking at obviously the critical skill set that you need, the desirable skill set that you need, and building it out from there, depending obviously on the nature of the company, or?
Well, I used to do a lot of board evaluations, and the first place I went to was to see the strategic plan, because that's going to inform the people you need around the boardroom table. Apart from basic financial skills or maybe legal skills, that would inform the skills you need, and then you've got to figure out how you find those skills. I mean, we have a big membership base in our organisation, so if you want to talk to us, we'll send out the profiles and see what happens, without wishing to plug the organisation. But I think you need to be really clear about the profiles you need around the boardroom table, and then find some way to find them. It isn't easy. You might have to use various channels like Boyden or other organisations. But there are organisations here that specialise in SMEs, because not everybody does.
Excellent. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw it to a close, and on your behalf, just say thank you very much to Gillian, to Conor, to David, and to John for a really riveting discussion, and just say thank you for your attention and your presence. And John, I might ask you just to close out the evening.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, David. This has been a fantastic opportunity for us to be here in Dublin. Thank you for joining us, David. Thank you so much for facilitating. And David, Conor, Gillian, thank you for partaking in today. It's a huge privilege for us to be here, to be with you, and to be able to exchange these views. Boyden is a nascent organisation in Ireland. We've grown quite a lot already, but Boyden's overall chief executive and co-chief executive, Nick and Lisa, please stand up for a second, are both here. And I'd just like to thank them for facilitating this. As much for Kevin and Morris. I feel like a conductor who's going. Thank you very much. And it wouldn't be fair of me not to thank Linda, wherever you are. Linda and Anna.
At the back, yeah.
Linda's outside and Anna's there, who've done a huge amount of work making sure that everything's on time, people are invited, people come here, there's refreshments, there's water, there's drinks, whatever. Anyway, the final thing I've been absolutely instructed to say is that there is something called an umbrella. There's an umbrella. There's a Boyden branded umbrella which is waiting outside, one for each one of you. Hopefully we don't need it. Oh, actually, we might need it. Who knows? Hopefully we don't need it this evening, but it's there for you to take away. So you've got a nice little memento of this evening. Thank you all for coming.